Sarah is nodding. Then I will also start the recording. And it seems to me that, Sarah, you should grant me the right so that I can start the recording, because for some reason I cannot do that. Well, it says recording. Okay, it works. Once again, welcome. My name is Svetlana Melnik, and I'm the senior lecturer at the Department of Slavic Languages and Eastern European Culture. And it is a pleasure to proceed with a series of our seminars, and we will have two very interesting presentations today. The first one is the presentation by Janush Panchenko, who is the PhD student at Zaporizhzhia National University. He is studying Roma groups in Ukraine and their position in the Ukrainian society, as well as the problem of preserving Roma language. Starting 2022, Janusz started researching the topic that has to do with Crimean Roma, and looked at it from the viewpoint of the minorities in Ukraine. And today he will be talking about the perception of ethnonyms Roma and Tsyhany in the public opinion of Ukrainian war conditions. Janusz, over to you. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you can see my slides on the screen. Yes, we can see them. Amazing. This is a recent research that we have conducted with my colleague, Mykola Humanuk, and Dr. Hristo Klitschko, who also does Roma studies. And this was a large study, and we touched upon a few aspects. And one of the aspects was the comparison of the perception of ethnic Roma and Tsyhany, or Gypsies, in the public opinion in Ukraine in war conditions. Now, a few words about the methodology. It was a sociological survey that covered 16 in-depth interviews, and there was also the qualitative survey that covered 902 persons. And we had a very proportionate a pool of people from different regions of Ukraine, represented to different age groups, and we analyzed the information that can be found in mass media outlets and books, in news, and other information channels. The thing is that lately, using the word Roma when speaking about the ethnical minority of Roma is becoming more and more relevant. And we surveyed people and tried to find out how they understand what Roma mean and what Tsyhany mean, whether these are same things or different things. And first, a little bit of the background. When Roma came the first time to the territory of Europe, which was 14th and 15th century, of course, the locals started giving them some names. And the names that were created back in the medieval times still exist in the modern day world. The most popular word is Gypsy, Gitanos, Gitans, as well as Tsyhany, Tsigani, and Tsyhanos. And if we look at them, these two names, well, there are more names than two, but you can basically divide them into two groups. The first one, Gitanos, Gitanos, come from the word Egyptians. And the second group comes from the Greek word Atiganos. That was used back in the Byzantine Empire. Where did these names come from? The thing is that when Roma ended up in Europe, they were explaining that they came from the small Egypt. But what they meant, in fact, was that they were talking about the modern Greece that was called small Egypt back in the day. But for the Europeans, they imagined that this is the actual Egypt that is in Africa. And therefore, the perception was that these people, Roma, are Egyptians. The other names, Tsyhany, Tsygoina, Tsigane, Tsiganos, they all stem from the same word, which is Atiganos. When Roma used to live in the Byzantine Empire, this was the name that was given to them by the people around them. And there are two versions about what this word used to mean. The first version is that it meant untouchable, and this is how Roma were called. And there is another version that there was a religious sect in the Byzantine Empire that was called Atiganos. And as Roma were back in the day associated with this religious sect, this name also was applied to Roma. Therefore, there were two versions to call them either Atiganos or Egyptians. And also the tribe of the pharaoh could be used. But it's important thing to say is that Roma never called themselves like that. This is all coming from the languages of the surrounding people. Now, regarding the self-name, in Europe there are 4 self-names for the Roma: Roma, Kale, Sinti, and Manush. But the most widespread is Roma. Kale, Sinti, Manush. They say that they are a separate ethnic group, but historically they are also Roma. But basically the ones that were separated from the main group. The word Roma is the word in plural, but Rom is a word in singular. It comes from the ancient Indian word Domba. This is the ancient name, but this word still exists. This caste still exists, which basically was engaged in singing and music. So a representative of this caste, one, is Domba. And the word Rom comes from this word. And there was the self-name and what the people around them used to call them. And this is how it was until 1971. In 1971, the first Romani World Congress took place in London, and they discussed various aspects. The anthem of the Roma people, the flag for the Roma people, the International Day of the Roma people was also established during that Congress. Other than that, the following request was discussed. They said that Roma should not be called Gypsy, Gitanas, and other ethnonyms should have not been used. Only the word Roma should have been applicable. That was back in 1971. Since that day, in the official paperwork and mass media, people started seeing the word Roma more and more. But this mostly was in the Western Europe. In the Soviet Union, however, it did not stay. It did not stay in Eastern Europe at all, in Poland included. But Western Europe, such countries as Germany, France, Great Britain, were gradually starting to use this word, but not exactly actively, as people started using this word more and more in the 90s only. The same has to do with Ukraine. After the Soviet Union collapse, this word for the first time was mentioned in official documents, Roma in 1999 and 2000s. And gradually this word started gaining popularity. But up to this day, the word Tsyhany is also used on par with the word Roma. And basically the objective of this research was to look at how the respondents, people surveyed by us, perceive these words. And during the in-depth interviews, we discovered that majority of the respondents say that these are two names of the same group of people. And here in the presentation are quotes from the interviews in the original language, either Russian or Ukrainian, depending on which language the respondent was using to communicate with us. However, some of the respondents feel, at least they think, that there is some difference between these two words, but they cannot provide a clear answer as to what this difference is. They do not have a clear answer as to what this difference between these two words is. And also, some of the respondents, some people, thought that Roma and Tsyhany belong to the same group, but Roma is the self-name, while Tsyhany is the name that is given by the surrounding people. Say, Ukrainians would apply this when talking about them. Also, there were assumptions that Roma is the literary or official name for the ethnic group, while Tsyhany is a, so to say, folk, colloquial name for this group of people.
І так само деякі респонденти
Apart from that, some of the respondents mentioned that Tsyhany has some negative connotation or is even an offensive word. And at the same time, they said that if you are talking to your close friends, then there is no negative connotation to this term. Only if it's used in media or in some official communication, then it is perceived as offensive. Another version is that Roma, the word Romani pertains to Romanian Romani. And of course, these two words, Roman people and Romanians and Romani, cause a lot of ambiguity. And many people believe that these two ethnic groups, Romanians and Romani, are the same ethnic group. And Romanian language is considered to be one of the Romani languages, and not only one of the Romani languages, but that Romanian equals Romani language. Although for the most of the respondents, Roma and Tsyhany are different names of the same group, some respondents actually mentioned that Tsyhany and Roma are from different groups, completely different, as Roma are perceived being the ethnic group with its own history, culture, language, traditions, and laws, and Tsyhany is perceived more as a lifestyle. All people from any nationality could be called Tsygan or Gypsy if this person lives a nomadic lifestyle that is also involving theft, poor hygiene, and similar notions. But even when respondents were trying to differentiate between these notions in such a way, one of the respondents mentioned that Roma belong to the ethnic group, unlike Tsyhany. And Roma have their own language and laws, and the language of the Roma people is the Tsyhany language. So there is still some confusion, even if people are able to differentiate between these two terms. Based on in-depth interviews, we may draw the conclusion that Tsyhany is more associated with nomadic lifestyle, and Roma is more associated with settled living. For instance, Ukrainian stand-up comedian Andriy Ozarkiev, in his performance, also tried to differentiate between these two notions. I would like to show you some videos from his performance.
Януше, у нас нічого не відбувається.
Janush, somehow nothing is happening on the screen. We cannot see anything. Well, all right, let me just tell you the story behind these videos. So, Andriy Ozarkiev is a Ukrainian stand-up comedian who is telling how to differentiate between Romani people and Tsyhany and the differences between these two words. So, Romani people are citizens of Ukraine that are not involved in theft, that are not stealing, and that are not robbing anyone, that are leading the same lifestyle as all the other citizens. Tsyhany are those people who you see on the railway stations. And they say that people who stole the tank from the Russians, those are Romani people. And people who used that tank as scrap metal later on, those are Tsyhany. And Romani people mostly live in cities. Meanwhile, Tsyhany live in rural areas.
Переважно так відбувалося, що респондентів цигани мали більш негативний контекст.
For most respondents, Tsyhany had the negative connotation and negative associations. But there were some other cases when the respondent mentioned that it depends on the context. And one of the respondents said that this word is ambiguous and its connotation depends on the way you are using it. As both these words are the same name of the same ethnical group, but Romani people, this is the term that is used for the official communication and for the legal purposes. I have also used the following question. What associations do you have when you hear these two words, Roma and Tsyhany? And you see that positive associations, in total 5% positive and rather positive. 5% in total, this is for Tsyhany. Speaking about Roma, it's 3 and 5% respectively, 8% total. Therefore, Roma enjoys more positive associations compared to Tsyhany. Neutral, 42% and 53% attributed to Tsyhany and the Roma terms respectively. And negative associations, or rather negative, in total 53% for Tsyhany, and for Roma 28 and 11%, 39% of negative associations with word Roma. Neutral markers or neutral associations that were mentioned by the respondents are the anthropological differences, like tan skin, dark hair, colorful, bright clothing, especially of women, and the nomadic lifestyle, or in the past or in present. Mostly they were referring to the past. And some respondents mentioned that Roma originate from India because they resemble Indians. This is the neutral association. And the positive associations for the words both Tsyhany and Roma. were the fact that Roma people are very artistic, highly musical, that they enjoy bright celebrations, vivid celebrations. Positive associations were also related to the stories that we heard from media in terms of the participation of Roma community representatives and the fighting of Russia's aggression. In 2022, at the beginning, there was the news about Roma people stealing a tank, a Russian tank. And there were some other pieces of news associated to Roma people serving in the army or volunteering. And it all caused positive associations. Starting 2022. And another aspect to mention is the next question, which reads as, what information have you come across in social networks or mass media that was related to Roma people in Ukraine? 55% of the respondents mentioned that it was the news about Roma people stealing that Russian tank. 18% of respondents mentioned Roma people being the refugees and displaced persons. 10% about Roma who suffered from the Russian occupiers. 9% of the respondents mentioned Roma who serve in the armed forces or police or the National Guard. 6% of the respondents mentioned Roma as volunteers, 2% other, and 13% did not remember what exactly they read about Roma people, and 19% said that they didn't come across any information regarding Roma people. Negative associations related to Roma and Tsyhany were mostly associated to some criminal activity and socially unacceptable behavior, which includes fraud, illegal trade, buying scrap metal, and begging. One of the narratives that was mentioned quite a few times is that Roma people have certain inclinations, like hypnotic skills, and they are using these hypnotic skills on other citizens in order to rip them off. Almost all the respondents mentioned this kind of stories, but nobody was ever the victim himself or herself. The most stories were like, my friend was approached by a Tsyhany woman and she stole money from her. And 16%, but I'm sorry, none of the respondents actually fall prey of this kind of hypnotic skills. It was not the first-hand experience. Another negative association with the Tsyhany and Roma, but mostly Tsyhany, is poverty. But poverty was also mentioned alongside wealth. As one of the respondents mentioned the following, I believe that we all have the same picture, more or less, but no, that's not true, because what I see is like big families and poor kids. And then this respondent mentioned, but most of the Tsyhany families are rich in our country, but the picture that I'm imagining in my head is the poor kids running around in some rags. And another respondent from Kherson mentioned that that Tsyhany or Roma have the house that stands out. This is the house that looks rich, and it's catching your eye because it's very vivid. It's all gilded. So some respondents mentioned that Roma and Tsyhany are associated with poverty or with wealth, but sometimes the same respondents mentioned the associations of poverty and wealth at the same time. Besides, the respondents mentioned the lack of autonomy of Roma groups and the fact that they are not included into the social lives, and that they are guided by their chiefs. Well, it's a very popular stereotype that there are these barons, but actually the Roma people are contributing to this stereotype. And speaking about the desegregation by regions, the highest number of negative associations were registered in the city of Kiev, 65% of negative associations and less than 2% of positive associations. Eastern Ukraine came second, 57% of negative and 3% of positive associations. And the highest rate of positive associations were found in the southern part of Ukraine, Odessa, Mykolaiv, and Kherson regions, up to 10% and 9%. And almost the same situation was with the Roma notion. Well, negative associations were fewer, but the desegregation by regions was basically the same as for Tsyhany. And we also interviewed people, our respondents in our in-depth interviews about the Roma people residing in their community. And it turned out that the fact that you have Roma people residing in your community has no impact on your associations, neither positive nor negative. The decisive factor for the positive associations was the work of the media, the news they came across in the media, or some literature pieces.
І останнім таким був опитуванням.
Also, one of the final things in our survey was, where does people's perception of Roma people come from? And 40% of people do not know Roma people and never interacted with them personally. And only 60% had personally interacted with them. Now, a few words regarding the words Roma and Tsyhany. The policy is the following now in Ukraine. It's similar to what used to happen in Europe. So basically now the word Tsyhany is not being used that much anymore, and the word Roma is used more and more. And presently the word Tsyhany is gaining more negative connotation because this word cannot be used in mass media outlets. But at the same time, there is a discussion ongoing in Ukraine. On the one hand, the same as the European countries, the word Tsyhany, Gypsies, has to become obsolete, and the South name Roma should be used instead. On the other hand, this mostly is something initiated by the civic activists, while Roma in Ukraine are fine with using the word Tsyhany, and they do not see any negative connotation for it. That is why part of the activists are in favor of this word becoming obsolete, and the other part is using the word Tsyhan. For example, the Union of the Tsyhans of the Southern Territories. This is the name of one of the organizations that are located in the south of the country. With the onset of the Russian invasion, the word Roma was used more and more, and activists started using this word more and more because, as I have mentioned previously, in the Soviet Union, the word Roma was not used after the Romani Congress. And after the Soviet Union collapsed, people in Ukraine started using the word Roma in the 90s, early 2000s. But in Russia, it is not used up to this date. They still are using the word Tsyhany. And in the context of the Russian invasion, the Roma community in Ukraine, especially the civic activists, are insisting even more on the word Tsyhany becoming obsolete so that they can differentiate themselves from Russia and from Russian Roma. Of course, this is a point for a discussion. And we're yet to find out how this will turn out to be in the nearest 10 to 15 years. But if we look at the situation 15 years ago, when the Roma themselves heard the word Roma, they were laughing at it. They used to laugh at it because it seemed unnatural. However, now this word seems to be a very normal one. So this is it from me. Now we can proceed with the discussion, and I can take your questions. And one important thing to mention is that Roma and Tsyhany are two names for the same group of people. Thank you so much, Janusz, for such an interesting, unbelievable, very informative presentation. Colleagues, now is the time for discussion. I'm pretty sure that you have lots of questions. Mihailo, go ahead. Thank you so much for such an interesting presentation, Janusz. I would like to say that I know Janusz in person because we're from the same city. That is why I would like to also mention that I talked to different representatives of the Roma community, and I wonder, how did you personally perceive the results of this survey through the prism of your ethnicity, of your ethnical background? How did the results of this research coincide with your understanding of the perception of the Roma people? Are they fair or are they unfair? I hope you understood my question. Thank you. Yes, thank you for the question. Well, I originally am from the Roma community, from the town of Kakhovka. And when we're carrying out this survey, this research with my colleague, Mr. Homeniuk, I recorded half of the interviews and he recorded 50% of the interviews. But the thing is, when I was doing that, people knew that I am a Roma myself. And in my interviews, there were no negative things brought up, openly. But when Mykola Homeniuk was surveying people or interviewing them, all of the negative associations from the research were recorded by him. And I think that there is some influence, because it's hard for people to say something negative when they are talking to Roma. That is why it was very interesting for me too, to take a look at the interviews recorded by Mykola and the public's perception. Well, the thing is that, This is not about the perception of certain people or individuals. It is about the perception of the ethnical group, all Roma people. That is why, well, yes, sometimes it's not very pleasant to read that type of things. I think it would be the same for the representative of any ethnical minority or ethnical majority to see this kind of associations mentioned during an interview. But this is the reality. This is a research. That's why we're not talking about what's wrong and what's right. We're talking about studying the public opinion the way it is. But of course, if I have to look at it through the prism of my personal perception, yeah, sometimes it was not pleasant to read. But you know, some things they do reflect reality. For example, things such as poverty, lack of sanitary yeah, that does happen, but it does not depend on whether they're Roma or not Roma. You know, any person can be poor, they can also engage in criminal activities, anyone can. But yes, there are some stereotypes about bronze, about, you know, this is made up. It's not substantiated in any way whatsoever because it was depicted in literature, on TV. It's created myth, basically, yes. As well about the nomad lifestyle. Even though we live in a very modern world in the 21st century, still, many people still believe that Roma are nomads, that they live in camps, these nomadic camps on horses, that their life has not changed in any way whatsoever over 70 years. And one more thing I'd like to mention, the Roma versus Tsyhany. Why do the activists are fighting for the word Roma to stay and Tsyhany to go obsolete? Because it's considered that the word Tsyhany is associated with lots of negative things. And here's the new term. It's clean from all those stereotypes and all the negative things. And it does not have this negative burden. But if you look at their research, there is a difference between the perception of the word Tsyhany and Roma, but the difference is minuscule. Speaking about positive association, the difference was only 3%, and neutral association, there was a difference of 10%. This is a very, very small number. So it cannot be resolved by changing the ethnonym. You cannot change the perception by simply changing the name. Great, thank you so much. Maria, go ahead. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for this presentation. And yeah, there was a lot of stereotypes. I learned lots of interesting things from your answers to the questions. But here's my question. Do you have the statistic data about where Roma people reside in Ukraine? And during your interviews, did you take into account this regional breakdown? Which criteria were used for you to pick the people for the interview, to pick your interlocutors? Thank you for the question. Look, it consisted of two parts: in-depth interviews, 16 of them, and we tried to pick people from different regions. Also, some migrants in Europe who came from Ukraine. And regarding the quantitative, there is a platform, the national platform called Lemur, and the sample is proportionate. So you can set the proportions, city versus rural area, the age, and the sample was proportionate, geographically wise. So yes, we did take into account regional peculiarities. Talking about where Roma people reside, according to official data, there are 47,500 Roma in Ukraine, approximately. This is not a big number, but when we surveyed respondents about who, in their opinion, belong to the ethnic minorities. Number one were Crimean Tatars, and number two were Roma. Even though the number seems to be very small, if when we ask people about national minorities, the second one they named was Roma. And speaking about where they reside, well, first, this is the officially 40,000 Roma, but we don't know the real numbers. Well, maybe not 10 times more, but probably twice the amount that we officially know about. And for example, as I have mentioned, I'm from Kherson Oblast. Officially, there are 1,700 Roma people who reside there, but our organization carried out a small sociological, well, yes, kind of sociological, but at the same time, we tried to understand how many Roma live in different localities in Kherson. And this was an initiative that took very little time. But back then, we managed to calculate that there are 3,000 Roma people who reside in Kherson Oblast, maybe slightly more, maybe 32 or maybe 3,400, but not more than that. So based on the research results compared to the official data about Kherson Oblast, there is twice the number of Roma people compared to the official data. Why is that so? Because the tools that are used to tally the number of Roma, these tools are not that efficient if we're talking about Roma people. Because first, many Roma people are trying to hide their nationality. If they can say something else, that they're not Roma, most of them will resort to that because there is lack of trust. Many Roma, since back the Soviet days, and in their birth certificates and passports, I'm not sure about the passports because I don't remember what the Soviet passport looks like, but I remember the birth certificate. Most Kherson Roma were mentioned as Romanians or Moldovans. Even my father was mentioned as a person from Romania. And based on this data, Roma continue hiding their true identity, and they say, I'm Romanian, because some of the documents mention that he is Romanian. And therefore, there is a larger number of Roma people compared to the official data. But again, it's probably maybe the double amount, maybe 2.5 times more. But yeah, coming back to your third question, the biggest number of Roma live in Transcarpathia, especially in the city of Uzhhorod. Number 2 is Odessa, and the third region is Donbas. These are 3 regions with the biggest number of Roma residing there. And there are Ukrainian Roma are not the homogeneous group. There are different subgroups with different history, different background. And in Transcarpathia, there are mostly Slovak and Hungarian Roma. This is the biggest region with Roma people. In Odessa Oblast, mostly from Chisinau, from Moldova, or from Kotlarts. They are also either from Moldova or Hungary. Donbas are mostly Ukrainian Roma, and they mostly live in Donetsk Oblast, also Luhansk Oblast, but mostly in Donetsk Oblast. They serve Roma.
Thank you very much, Janusz. Please, Sarah, go ahead.
Thank you. Before I ask my question, Janusz, maybe you would like to address the comment in the chat that Anna put. She said the last census was in 2001, so these data are not up to date. Do you have any response to that or thoughts?
Ну так, останній перепис був у 2001
Well,
році.
yes, indeed, the last census took place in 2001, and as of 2023, of course, the data are not very accurate and updated. But even for 2001, Even back then, when the census was carried out, the data were not very accurate regarding Roma people.
Зрозуміло, дякую.
Thank you. Well, I'll
clear.
welcome everyone in thanking you for this really interesting presentation, Janusz. I have a question that's related to education. It might sound like a naive question from someone who's not very familiar with the Ukrainian educational system, but I'm wondering, where do people get their perceptions about Roma, and is there any mention and descriptions of Roma in like history lessons in school, in social studies, anything like that, that might help mitigate these kinds of negative associations that you've been describing?
Ну, я думаю, про шкільній програмі такого немає.
Well, speaking about school curriculum, it is not actually covered. Yes, Roma people are mentioned, speaking about history in general. For instance, when the school children are studying the Second World War and Holocaust events, Roma people are mentioned as the victims of Holocaust alongside Jews, and maybe in literature.
З ромами, якщо вони з ними ще не знайомі, наприклад, там зарубіжна література, це
For instance, foreign literature.
але щось такого офіційної якоїсь програми
Um,
немає.
for instance, in Google, but officially there is no mention of Roma in curriculum as something
Дуже дякую.
particular.
Ще питання, шановні
Thank
колеги?
you very much. Any other questions?
Так, Мар'яну, прошу.
Mariana, please go ahead.
Дякую, ніяк не знайду, де той
Thank
піднімається.
you. I was struggling with finding that raise your hand reaction. Janusz, I have the following question. I was taken aback by these graphs when mostly negative associations are related to the whole ethnic group. Apparently, in Ukrainian society, there are certain stereotypes that are used as the grounds for such reactions from the respondents. So my question is as follows. What are the main factors for such stereotypes to exist, and where do they originate from? Maybe we could eliminate some of those factors or some of those causes of stereotypes.
Очевидно, що більше грають
As
роль, які про нього наративи циркулюють.
these narratives actually matter, the narratives that are disseminated.
Це таке цікаве питання, насправді. Ось,
It's an interesting question.
Роми
Indeed,
асоціюються
Roma people
там з крадіжкою.
are associated with stealing, with theft for many respondents. But if we are talking about some official institution like banks are stealing many more and much more from people, but banks do not enjoy these associations unlike Roma people. So yes, it's about the image that has been created. And it just happens so that the further people are from the state, from official institutions, the more segregated they are. And of course, there are different stereotypes. And I cannot say that they are all groundless, that it's all fiction. No, that is not the case. As begging was mentioned as negative association, yes, indeed, there are Roma people who are beggars. And there are some Ukrainians who are also begging and whom you could meet at the railway station in Kyiv. But the association sticks to Roma people. I think it could be explained also by the fact that Roma community is very closed. that you get the information about Roma people just from some conversations, from some gossiping. Many people mentioned these hypnotic skills, but no one experienced it firsthand. I think that the biggest issue here is the image that is created. For instance, banks versus Roma people, and the closeness of the community, which causes misunderstanding and stereotypes. For instance, if you see people on the railway station who are begging, you are associating them with Roma people. Another problem is that Roma people are contributing to these stereotypes. Well, I would disagree that it helps us, but many Roma people believe that these stereotypes are beneficial to our community. As, for instance, these magical skills, the supernatural skills. Roma people are sustaining this stereotype as it helps them to protect themselves from outsiders. They want to be afraid of barons. This is the stereotype. They never existed. It's not like they existed back in the past. This is just an image from cinema, but this stereotype is so strong that sometimes it's easier to agree that there is this baron and find some guy and appoint him as a baron than to destroy the stereotype. I remember there was the TV show on 1+1 TV channel, which is called Roma Blood, Tsyhany Blood. And this was the movie about the Roma people of Ukraine. I think it was filmed in 2015, 2016. They called us and they wanted to film some scenes in our city, Novakhovka, and they asked us about the Baron. Could we meet your Baron? And we told them, no, we do not have a Baron in our city. They do not exist. And when we told them that Barons do not exist, they were not satisfied with this answer. Well, how could it be? Someone has to be a Baron. So it took me 20 minutes to explain that Baron does not exist, and the crew was insisting on finding that Baron. Therefore, we were not included into that film. Sometimes it's easier to show someone as a Baron than to explain that Baron does not exist. Thank you very much, Janusz. Valerie, please go ahead. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Thank you very much for this fascinating presentation. I wanted to ask you the following. Many national minorities and ethnic groups were described in historic literature, Bulgars, for instance, and other ethnic groups. But is there the history of Ukrainian Roma people? Unfortunately, Roma studies, well, it is not well represented in Ukraine. It is actually missing. In Ukraine, there is no researcher of Roma history, of Roma origin or non-Roma origin. In the 1930s, 1940s, 1920s, there were some studies in the Soviet Union. And there are some studies of certain groups like Ukrainian Roma. Notion encompasses many ethnic groups. If we're talking about Roma from Zakarpattia, the Slovak Roma people, their history is rather well studied, and the language as well, but not in Ukraine, in Slovakia. But it's the same ethnic group that resides in Slovakia and in Uzhhorod. But speaking about the Roma of Ukraine, I cannot say that there are no studies at all, but there is no exhaustive, in-depth research on the language, neither history. It is simply not there. Thank you. Well, we do understand as researchers that certain negative connotations are attributed to those nations that are not well known to the major nation. For instance, Jews. Well, in order to change the image of a certain nation, the information has to be disseminated about this nation. The history has to be told about, and it requires a lot of awareness raising and explaining that Roma are not the beggars on the railway station. So my question is it high time to come up with some publication about Roma? Are you ready to publish a book on it? Thank you for mentioning that. Within this study that I showed you, one of the parts of the study was the renowned Roma people of Ukraine, and we asked the respondents, Ukrainian respondents, who could you name as the renowned Roma people? Just a second, I would like to show you that table. Who was on that list?
Так, є. Тепер зроблю демонстрацію.
Oh, here it is. Let me share my screen.
Щось не можу знайти, як зробити демонстрацію саме не на презентацію, а на весь екран.
Sorry, I'm a bit struggling with sharing my screen. Okay, here it is.
Так, так вам видно, працює?
All right, can you see my slide?
Виходить, що найбільш, почнемо з того, що десь
Well, let's start from the fact that
62% взагалі
62% of respondents couldn't mention anyone, any distinguished Roma person. And the most recognizable, the most renowned Roma in Ukraine is Petro Chorny, then Mykola Slipchenko. Mykola Slipchenko is a singer. And now with the popularity rate of patriotic songs, he is becoming even more popular because in 2004, 2005, he was rather popular, and now he is back on stage. Then we have Mikhailo Volodira, who is an actor, and he is famous for the Wedding in Malinovka movie. And Valentin Mihai, he played the part of Budulai. They were two parts of this movie. Lala Жемчужна, she is the actor, but her character on the stage was more recognizable. She played as a gypsy in a movie. And Ivo Bobo. Well, frankly speaking, we have Budulai and Aza the Gypsy. Those are the characters that were created in Soviet Union, the images that are very strong and are very memorable. At this point in time, we do not have these strong images in Ukrainian movies. Even though these movies are dating back to Soviet times, they are still rather popular. And Mikhail Volodymyr was not even Roma. He was just playing the part of a Roma character. He is from Moldova. Thank you.
Яка прекрасна у нас було чудове.
Thank you so much, Janusz. It was an amazing, informative, very fascinating discussion. We talked about education. We didn't have enough time to talk about the language. Well, sadly, this presentation is coming to its end. Nevertheless, we're very grateful for such an interesting and relevant topic. Thank you so much, Janusz. Thank you all for your attention. Okay, now let's proceed with the next